I think the Israelis do bear a lot of the onus for the difficulty that they find themselves in, both in terms of planning and in terms of popular perception, which has been catastrophic for them. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you this fine, sultry summer day?
I was going to say it's horrible out there. You know, it was about 100 degrees last time I checked. I'm doing fine. As always, you know, I have to confess, I always had this anxiety since we introduced this jackassery of the week that we would run out of material. You know,
Never.
The penalty of doing a weekly show. But no, that turns out not to be the case. And as has so often been true in the past, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is really the gift that keeps on giving. So the latest thing is the Pentagon suspending participation in think tank events unless you've been cleared. Now, there's ambiguity about what this really means. For sure, though, if you're going to deliver remarks or something, it has to be cleared personally, I think either by the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy or the General Counsel, or, you know, some other very, very senior political commissar who actually has other things to do. And this is all part of, we hate the globalist establishment. If you may remember, Hegseth referred, or his spokesman referred to the Aspen Security Group as a bunch of evil globalists. It's of a piece with Hegseth apparently having been told to knock off polygraphing his subordinates. You know, of course, it's appalling that you have this knucklehead as Secretary of Defense who's clearly way, way, way over his head. But there is something appallingly comic about it, I'm afraid. But maybe I'm just not being serious.
No, I mean, you know, I hate to keep picking on him, but as you say, he is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, on a more serious note, I mean, everything you said, of course, is true, and it, you know, is indicative of, you know, a kind of lack of seriousness. I mean, first of all, on the, you know, keeping military officers out of think tank events, you and I know how easy it is in the government, and I did 2 tours in the Pentagon, to get completely wrapped up in, you know, inside baseball, and you know, not allowing, you know, officers or civilians in the Pentagon to get an outside perspective is just incredibly silly and very, you know, damaging and intellectually limiting. But even, you know, on a more serious note, you know, there was a story in the paper yesterday, I think it was in the Post yesterday, about the degree to which he continues to be, you know, at 6s and 7s with the flag officers, and his refusal to promote General Douglas Sims, the director of the Joint Staff, at first allegedly because he thought he was a leaker, and then he was cleared of that. And then it turned out to be he was too close to General Milley, who of course had been his superior officer. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And the refusal to promote Rear Admiral Michael Donnelly and make him commander of the 7th Fleet, because at one point when he was commander of the Ronald Reagan and it crossed the equator, they had a, quote, drag show, which, as you know, is a tradition in the U.S. Navy, not just the U.S. Navy, but the British Navy, going back hundreds of years.
Yeah, well, you should, if nothing else, you should watch the musical South Pacific,
right,
from World War II, right, where they're guys dancing with a pair of coconuts on their chest. No, I mean, it is truly juvenile. I suspect it's not just Hegseth, but some of the people around him. You know, our dear old friend and boss Al Bernstein always said, "First-rate people hire second-rate people. Second-rate people hire third-rate people. Third-rate people hire nuts." And I think that's part of what's happened here is that some of the people, some of his aides are really, completely nuts. I also, they're. I mean, it ultimately it does point to something quite serious. I mean, God help us if we get into a serious crisis. Secondly, from everything I've heard, the antipathy between the General Officer Corps and the Secretary is profound. I mean, they really dislike and mistrust this guy. I mean, they will dutifully follow orders and keep it to themselves and so forth. But I'm sure he can sense that, and because I think he's fundamentally a weak character, that'll make him more paranoid, make him do more crazy things. So this is very bad. I mean, I don't think he's going to break the General Officer Corps at all. Actually, maybe the other way around. But it's terrible to have this level of tension and suspicion and hostility. The one very faint ray of sunshine, and as you know, I am always looking for the sunny side, is the White House apparently told him to knock off polygraphing your subordinates. And actually, if I could just indulge in a partial rant on that one, the polygraph is an awful instrument. I mean, it's not based on actual science. It is 1920s technology. It does not detect lies. It may detect certain kinds of stress among certain kinds of people, partly depending on your cultural background. It can be beaten. It's damaged a lot of careers. It's basically a tool of intimidation for an interrogator. And it is demeaning as well as useless to begin using this on your subordinates. And the kind of mistrust that radiates, this is just poisonous to leadership. I mean, there's a reason why this guy couldn't get beyond major. I mean, I'm almost beginning to think it's miraculous that Hegseth got up to the level of captain. It was probably because we were desperate at the time. But he's just an awful leader. And like I said, the faint ray of sunshine in this is if the White House, is finally going to lose patience with him and put in somebody who's at least marginally better.
Yeah, on the polygraph, as I recall, the late Senator Sam Ervin referred to it as 20th century witchcraft, and we're now in the 21st century. Um, I seem to also recall, correct me if I get this wrong, but I believe Rick Ames, Aldrich Ames, one of the biggest
Yes.
traitors in the history of the CIA, beat the polygraph multiple times. Um, and so, yeah, I quite agree with you. I mean, on a lighter note, in terms of jackassery, you know, one of the less bright lights in the U.S. House of Representatives has attached an amendment to rename the Opera House at the Kennedy Center after the First Lady Melania Trump. And not to be outdone, there's now an amendment to strip the Kennedy Center of the John F. Kennedy name and to rename it the Donald Trump Center for the Performing Arts.
You know,
But it's not a cult. It's not a cult.
to see ourselves as others see us, I will just look back at this and guffaw. I think, although it's appalling. I don't think we've ever had a Congress composed of so many really petty, sycophantic, useless people.
Yeah, it's that
Anyway.
that's a depressing subject. Um, but like again, looking for the positive, the president did reverse himself, or not reverse himself. He reversed the Pentagon's decision to cut off aid to Ukraine. So aid to Ukraine is still flowing, and the president still appears to be um, uh, losing patience, over a very long period of time with Vladimir Putin, and he's now revised his 50-day, ultimatum, that he would decide what to do in 50 days. He's now shortening it down to 10 to 12 days, and Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, awoke from a drunken stupor and tweeted that, or on Telegram, wrote that this was going to increase the chances of a war between the United States and Russia, and encouraging President Trump not to go down the road of sleepy Joe Biden, as he said. So, what's your take on all that?
Well, being a former professor, my immediate reaction is, "I told you so," uh, and indeed I did. Actually, I had a piece in the Atlantic last week, which was really gently but firmly disagreeing with friends of ours who think that Trump has decided to align the United States with Russia, that he simply loathes Ukraine and is acting as a Russian agent in some way. And I said, as I personally find him loathsome. That but you also have to just respect what the facts are, and the facts are it's not the way he's behaved. And in fact, with the way I would interpret this latest thing is this is one more kind of signpost that he's lost patience with Putin. Now that's taken a long time, and I think he started from a position of misplaced empathy. Let's put it that way. That Putin's a tough guy, I'm a tough guy, kind of thing. But I think that has eroded over time as a number of things have happened. One is, I think he's seen that Putin is not interested in a deal, and Trump does want to have a deal. I think he probably resents being played and realizes, although he could never quite admit as much, that he's been played. I think he genuinely does not like the destruction that's being levied on Ukrainian cities. I think he probably was impressed by Spiderweb, that quite daring attack that the Ukrainians launched. I think he's quite open to. I think he's been actually handled very well by the Europeans. As somebody said, if anybody who says flattery will get you nowhere has clearly never been flattered. Mark Rutte, all credit to him. It's I'm sure hard to look at himself in the mirror after doing it, but they think they did well, and I think they've cut a good deal. So okay, the Europeans will be buying lots of American hardware. So I think it's moving more or less in the right direction. And the other tell in this, of course, is personnel, because as we both know, personnel is policy. So Steve Witkoff, who was really a naive in dealing with the Russians, has been sidelined, it looks like, and it's Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg, both of whom are much more sympathetic to Ukraine. So, on the whole, I think it's good. I guess I had two large points, and then I'd like to hear what you have to say. One is it doesn't resolve the fundamental issue, which is how does this thing end or terminate? And as we've discussed often, the problem is defense is kind of a mug's game. And the Russians increasingly being able to tap Chinese industrial support, North Korean industrial support, maybe Iranian, I'm less sure about, can swamp Ukrainian defenses. And so the question is not just giving the Ukrainians defensive weapons, but is there something that will kind of coerce the Russians to the table? Maybe we just have to wait as pressures develop. But it does sort of beg the question a bit. But I think there's a broader issue here, which I'm very interested in, which we may be able to explore in later on in a different venue. And that is the problem that those of us in the policy world, either as commentators or observers or experts, and certainly as participants, have in dealing with cognitive dissonance, where you got to believe two opposite things at the same time. And I think that really has led a lot of people to misinterpret what Trump has done. I think it's led them to misinterpret some of what Netanyahu has done, and it really gets in the way. And you really have to wrestle with it, because politics is, among other things, the realm of emotions, and your emotions can get control of your analysis, and I think you have to fight it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Emerson who said the mark of intelligence was being able to hold two
Yep.
contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. Um, I mean, I largely agree with your assessment. I mean, I do think, as I've said before on the show, that I think Trump does want to normalize relations with Russia, and I think he thinks there's some big business deals to be done, which I think is also an illusion. And I think, as you were saying a moment ago, Steve Witkoff was particularly coming from the same kind of background as Trump. Equally, if not more susceptible, because he knows even less, to that kind of blandishment from the Russians. And I do think Trump is. I mean, I think a lot of people have told him, people whom he respects and whose views he takes seriously, that he is being played by Putin, and the upsurge in attacks after each phone call with Putin can't have escaped his attention. So I think that's all true. By the same token, he still is very reluctant to pull the trigger on sanctions. I mean, I think the 10 to 12 day now instead of 50-day deadline, I think tells you, in my view, two things. One, he understands that the 50-day deadline was probably a mistake because it kind of gave the Russians a long opportunity to beat the crap out of Ukrainian cities, which is what they were doing. But it also tells you he still doesn't want to pull the trigger on the sanctions bill, which is sitting up there. And that, look, the bill has got all sorts of flaws, but I think in addition to sort of offensive strike weapons, which I think the Ukrainians do need in order to bring the war home to Russia and Russians, even more than they already have. I mean, they have created a lot of havoc with both trains and planes in Russia. So there has been a certain amount of that. They need to be able to do more. But the Russian economy still is, Putin's Achilles heel, I think. And ramping up the pressures economically are clearly going to have to be part of what ultimately convinces him that he's not going to be able to get what he wants. And the other element, which Trump has been a little bit better about this time around than last time, is that as long as Putin nurses the hope that he can split the Americans and the Europeans, he'll be inclined to continue. And so I agree with you. I think Ruta, as distasteful as it may have been to see his, gross sucking up to Trump, at least kept the NATO summit from, displaying a lot of division. And that's I think all to the good.
I think we also have to be willing to accept that there's been change, not completely. I mean, Trump is still who he is. When the first one, there was a serious danger that he was going to try to pull us out of NATO, which he didn't understand and all that. And this one, he came away, yes, they tailored the summit so that there wouldn't be anything controversial, but the mood music was fine. And I think, from his point of view, and not entirely incorrectly, it was a success. What's the nature of his success? Well, he's bullied the Europeans into accepting these large kind of target defense spending. Okay, will they hit 5% of GDP? No, of course they won't. Have they increased their defense spending in part as a result of his behavior and his threats? I think so. I mean, it worked.
Not just him, though. I think, in fairness, it's also a growing appreciation of the Russian threat.
Oh, unquestionably, but I think fear of American abandonment and fear of Trump played a role too. I mean, I hate that. I wish it weren't the case, but I think it probably did play some sort of role. I think he sees now more positives in that. Well, this is a great market for U.S. arms and for building up the defense industrial base. And true enough. And if the Europeans do have the resources to do this. This is a war that's happening on their continent. I mean, it's not entirely crazy, I think. I mean, it's not generous. And then I think, there may even be, this I'm less sure of, but I think it's possible that this is going on too, an awareness that with Ukraine, you really have the opportunity to develop some of the cutting edge defense military technologies that we can use as well. And I just saw, just before I got on, I don't know if it's true or not, that there's a deal with a German-American drone manufacturer that's going to be giving tens of thousands of AI-powered drones to the Ukrainians. This was just cleared by the Defense Department. I think there is an awareness that this is a lot of the new modes of warfare being kind of tested out on the ground in Ukraine, and that there's something for us there as well. So, and I guess the very last thing I'll say is we've been beating up on poor Pete Hegseth quite a bit. I get the sense he's not nearly as bad on Ukraine as Bridge Colby is, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, your old job, who's just kind of monomaniacal about the Indo-Pacific and about China, and who seems to have been responsible for this foolish suspension of aid, and then kind of waking up and being told by the White House, "No, you're not."
Yeah, I mean, my sense is both of them are kind of in a doghouse with people at the White House, with the possible exception of the vice president's office. Vice president, I think, shares Bridges' concerns about Ukraine. I'm not sure how much he shares the view about prioritizing the Indo-Pacific, because I think he may be more of a true isolationist, in the classic
I'm not
sense.
sure he has any convictions whatsoever, but
That's also a possibility.
maybe I'm misjudging him, but he really has been such a shapeshifter that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And for an isolationist to go spend your summer vacation in the Cotswolds, which is really high snoot English upper crust.
Well,
Really?
there I have to, I do have to push back. Don't forget that Charles Lindbergh decamped to the United Kingdom for several years, and was so. I mean, you could be an isolationist and still be an Anglophile.
A Nazi sympathizer. I mean, right. This is, if that's the defense, then boy, you're in trouble. And let me stipulate, my wife and I went on a walking holiday in the Cotswolds, but we weren't hanging around with no fancy pants aristocrats. We were just slogging through the mud.
Yeah, there you go. Well, let's move to another topic that where Trump's views may be evolving, as we like to say in Washington, which is Gaza and what's going on in Gaza. The president, in his meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, said when being asked questions that he absolutely thinks starvation is taking place in Gaza, and certainly from the all the press accounts that one sees in the major mainstream U.S. press, one would be led to believe that. This is, I think, a very complicated story that it has been made more complicated, I think, unfortunately, by some of the things Israel has done that has opened it up to some criticism, very well deserved, some not so deserved. But you want to talk about that? I mean, you pointed out to me this morning the very interesting and I would say very complex piece by Matti Friedman, the Israeli journalist in the Free Press, about precisely this subject.
Yeah, so Matti Friedman, who's a very good journalist, not a friend of the Israeli government by a long shot, had a very interesting piece in the Free Press. And he made a number of points, one of which is it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on where. And, you should, when it's your turn, you should talk a little bit about your view of American journalism covering this. The truth is, it's very hard. It's very hard to figure out. Undoubtedly, there's a huge amount of human suffering. There's no question about that. I mean, that's unquestionable. There are a number of things that are, however, striking about. One is there's nobody who's saying, well, this is really the fault of Hamas. If they, surrendered and accepted exile, not firing squads, but exile, and handed over the hostages that they seized, this would be over. So first, nobody seems to talk about that in the slightest. There are, innate contradictions between what is sometimes being asked of the Israelis. We want you to protect the distribution of humanitarian aid, but we don't want you there. We don't want to be associated with you. So, which is it? But I will say, and here I will be to be the harshest things one can say about the Israeli government, which I will say, is first, and this is just a deep-seated Israeli problem. And it was obvious to me even when I visited Israel a couple months after the October 7th, 23 massacres, that there was really no strategic planning for, okay, what happens after the initial campaigns, however many months they last. It just there just wasn't anything. And it's, kind of a commonplace, but it's absolutely true that the Israelis are brilliant tactically and operationally. And then strategically, there's a vacuum. Now, there are various reasons for that, which we can go into if you like. But it's absolutely, I think, the case here that you just don't have a sense of strategic thing. And a very bright former Israeli colonel who was one of their strategic planners once said, it's no accident that we Israelis can only speak about strategy in English. He said to me, and I think that registers. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is there is something sinister about the current leadership of the Israeli government. And I mean, here again, let me tap into that cognitive dissonance thing. I think on the one hand, my view of what the Netanyahu and his government did vis-a-vis Iran, and before that vis-a-vis Hezbollah, that was rational. It may not have been decisive. I'm not sure what could be decisive, but it was measured. It was appropriate. It was strategic in some sense. This, I have to say, I think is driven by domestic politics of a pretty sordid kind. And the basic issue, as I think our listeners will know, is undoubtedly when this government comes to an end, however it comes to an end, there will be a state commission of inquiry. And, Netanyahu will most definitely be in the dock and should be in the dock for, setting the conditions that led to October 7th. Secondly, he fears that deeply. He's been sort of blackmailed by the really awful hardline right wingers, Itamar Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who really are kind of racists and fanatics, who've threatened to leave the coalition, which would bring it down if he accepted a deal, and Netanyahu bowed to that. So I think the war is being continued for sordid domestic considerations. Most Israelis think that too, if you believe the polls, which I do. There's clearly anger about this at high levels in the military, certainly among families of reservists and so forth. But I think that's the unfortunate truth. Last thing I'll say is our old colleague David Satterfield, who's served many, many roles in the Middle East, and I think is a pretty level head. There was an interview with him where he said, look, there's really only one solution, which is you got to just flood Gaza with humanitarian relief. That's what you do now. And I think he's absolutely right. That is the only thing that you can do. Now, by the way, that begs the question of, what are you going to do later on for shelter? What are you going to do when the winter comes? What are you going to do, eventually for jobs and stuff like that? All of which, again, there just is no thinking about that I can detect.
I mean, this does become a very emotional discussion, and people start throwing words like genocide around, and not just people, by the way, who are inveterate, enemies of Israel or anti-Semites. I mean, Omer Bartov, the very,
I have a darker view of Omer Bartov, but go ahead.
well, I mean, he is, a renowned scholar of the Holocaust and of the German military during World War II. He had a piece in the New York Times. I don't agree with it, but he did, say that this is tantamount to genocide. But you've also got Israeli groups at home saying now, throwing the genocide, word around. To put this in the best context for the Israelis, they went to war with a terrorist organization that uses civilians as human shields, and which builds tunnels under hospitals and does everything it can to make to increase the chances that there will be collateral damage if and when they are hit by the Israelis militarily. Knowing that, I think the Israelis have tried pretty hard to minimize collateral damage. And on the one hand, you can say that 50,000 people have been killed, out of a population of almost 2 million. That's a lot, but it's not clear those numbers are accurate. Those numbers don't take into account the number of fighters who've actually been killed, combatants as opposed to non-combatants. But as you said, there's no gainsaying the fact that there's enormous human suffering going on, and the Israelis have compounded their own problems, on at multiple points. I mean, you've made the point about the lack of a strategy or planning for the day after. They also have taken some steps which I think are understandable in setting up this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to provide the assistance, but they've woefully under resourced it and almost designed it in a way that would guarantee failure. And you're seeing the results of that now. Particularly in light of the fact that you got ministers of the government, calling for the expulsion of the population of Gaza, calling for them to be starved, and then you don't let independent press in. It's just inevitable that you're going to get what you've gotten. And I think the Israelis do bear a lot of the onus for the difficulty that they find themselves in, both in terms of planning and in terms of popular perception, which has been catastrophic for them. It's catastrophic, not just it's catastrophic because of countries like France and the UK being alienated. It's catastrophic because of what it's doing to popular support for Israel in this country, including alienating Donald Trump, who's been willing to pretty much give them a blank check to do whatever the hell they wanted. And I think the long-term consequences of this for the state of Israel are going to be very bad, and are going to reverberate for a long time, unfortunately.
Alas, I completely agree with that. I think the genocide thing it drives me crazy. Genocide means you want to wipe out an entire people. If they really wanted to wipe out the population of Gaza, they would have done that by now. I mean that's it. And so I think it's an inflammatory word. It's an inaccurate word. The realities are bad enough. They faced a wicked problem in that, on the one hand, look, they couldn't trust UNRWA, which was thoroughly penetrated by Hamas, which had officials who were members of Hamas. Okay, so they don't have other agencies they can work with. I think, unlike us in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, because it's an incredibly hostile population, understandably, and vice versa, the Israelis can't go in and do it themselves, and actually administer it. So who does it? I think the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was probably a good idea. They would have been wiser to begin standing that thing up way earlier. All of this, I think, is part of it goes back to the astounding failure of October 7th, that, they really didn't have a war plan for this kind of thing. They had tactical and operational plans for what were essentially raids into Gaza, but they didn't have a plan for, what happens if we have to occupy the strip and really try to dig Hamas out.
And Bibi had a track record of not wanting to do it. I mean, we hope in September to have Yaakov Katz on, the former editor in chief of the Jerusalem Post and co-author of the book While Israel Slept, which will be appearing in September. And part of the point he makes in the book is Bibi all along never wanted to go back into Gaza, always restrained other people in the military who thought it might be necessary.
Yeah. This is part of by the way, the irony is that Bibi was always known to be cautious about the use of force. I mean, he has changed, and almost invariably for the worse. But he always actually, the rhetoric was always kind of tough guy talk. But actually, if you look at what he was willing to authorize, it was much more modest. It was one of the reasons, I think, why the attack on Iran was as much of a surprise as it was to a lot of people. No, but it's unquestionably a mess. There's a large part of it which is of Israel's making. The largest part, we do have to remember, is Hamas's making.
Yeah, no, I agree.
You had some thoughts when we were sitting in the green room before this about American journalism, though, and international journalism. And I'll have one thought about President Macron, but I think yours is more important.
Look, part of this, as I said, is that the Israelis have forbidden journalists to go in to Gaza with, not unlike us when we went into Iraq, where we embedded journalists with our troops so they could see exactly what was going on. The Israelis have kept journalists out, which means they're all forced to rely on stringers who are Gazans, and in some cases, Hamas sympathizers, and so it was inevitable that they were going to get bad press, given how they've done that. There also is been, I think, a real breakdown in sort of the quality of American journalism. That's not to say that there aren't some really first-rate, terrific American journalists, both military correspondents and others. But you see things like the picture that was shown of the, purported to be a starving child in Gaza, who turns out to be a victim, tragically, of cerebral palsy, which explains some of the way the child looked. And the Times just prints this, and the BBC just runs with this. There was the last week a New York Times reporter who kind of went into Kursk with the Chechen forces, who are some of the worst war criminals in the war in Ukraine, to document the terrible things Ukraine did when they were fighting in Kursk. I mean, this is just I think for a paper that bears the stigma of having had one of its most famous correspondents, Walter Duranty, in the 1930s, denying the reality of the starvation of Ukrainians in the famine that was created by Stalin and the purges. To not be putting a check on this kind of, I would say, just bad journalism is really worrisome. And then you've got the situation in the Washington Post, where just people are fleeing the Post, including for the Atlantic. I worry about the state of journalism. I worry about the fragmentation of how Americans are getting their information. And I mean, one of the reasons we do this podcast is because more and more Americans are actually getting their information from podcasts than they are from the traditional media. And I know that may or may not be a good thing. I'm not sure.
Well, if they're listening to us, it's clearly a good thing. Uh, let's move on to this is grim. I don't mean to make light of it. It's a very grim situation, and I think the only, again, what could there possibly be that could good that come out of it? I mean, sooner or later, the Bibi's government will fall. That coalition will fall. It may fall over the issue of drafting the ultra orthodox.
Yeah, redeem, yeah.
It may fall over some sort of ceasefire in Gaza if we lean on the Israelis, and then I think you'll get a different kind of Israeli government, hopefully led by somebody like Gadi Eisenkot or somebody like that, who'll be much more to our way of thinking. I mean, I do think it's important to stress to people is most Israelis don't want this, and they don't think this is good. And just the way the Israeli political system operates, it's Bibi calling the shots. And in the same way that, let's face it, you can have a president elected here with a minority of the popular vote, and in the UK you can have somebody with what was it, 36% of the vote and a decisive majority in the House of Commons. So that's part of the anomaly. I do want to throw just one dart though at President Macron of France.
Easy to do.
Deciding that, okay, now's the time. I'm going to show the Israelis. I'm going to recognize Palestine. So this is at a time when the Palestinian Authority has like zero credibility on the West Bank, when there's very little chance of a real Palestinian state. All it can do is annoy the Israelis, It'll get you no credit anywhere else in the world. It's, you and I both have dear friends who are French diplomats, and at its best, the French are terrific. And this is not the best. This is vanity, and it helps explain why I think the French have had it. I found it very difficult to exercise the kind of leadership in Europe that they would like to exercise, because this is, kind of a monarchical style that just doesn't go down well with anybody else.
The best thing I can say about President Macron, who of course um, is term limited, so he will not be able to run again, uh, is that I hope he and Brigitte Macron are successful in their lawsuit against Candace Owens. um,
uh,
we, while we're on the Middle East, we probably should touch on both Iran and Syria, which are also, crucial subjects. Not a whole lot, I don't think, to say right now about Iran, other than, um, although there are some folks who are, still wanting to insist that the strikes by Israel and the United States did nothing really um, beneficial in the region or to the Iranian nuclear program. I think the column by David Ignatius in the Post the other day that concludes the same thing that you and I have concluded a couple of times, which is that this, set of actions has set back the Iranian program by a year or two, and that created potentially some opportunities for Iran to back off and to negotiate. The Europeans are now negotiating with Iran. They're holding over Iran's head the possibility of snapback of sanctions, which would be very damaging to a regime that already is like economically very strapped and facing potentially huge water shortages in
yeah,
Tehran. They could
shortage
end
of
up,
water in Tehran.
yeah, and depopulate the capital and whatnot. So uh, I think we'll have to see where it goes. But I'm struck by the fact that although they're not cooperating with the IAEA inspectors, they have not withdrawn from the NPT, and they're keeping their options open. And there does seem to be some internal uh, debate and fight over which direction to take.
So that's the Iranian style, I think. I so a couple two thoughts. One is, there was a piece by Rule Gorecht and I think Ray Take, both of whom argued that the succession to Khamenei will probably come from the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that basically this will be more hardline, even more ideological, even more committed to struggle and violence and so on. And my thought about that was, well, that's plausible, but we don't know about what the internal splits are, and so on. And that, and as you know, I'm always skeptical of the argument. Well, if the current leadership goes, then the hard men take over. And we heard that said about Stalin, after all. Um, so that's one thought that I have. But the other thing that in recent days has kept on running through my head is a line from the speech that Solzhenitsyn gave in, what was it, 78 or 79 at Harvard, A World Split Apart, which this is the one that everybody got very upset about because he was being critical of the West. And one thing he says, look, any deeply rooted civilization is something of a riddle to outsiders. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we are dealing here with a very deep civilization, um, on which you now have this layer of kind of revolutionary um, Islamism of a particular type, which was, in some ways at variance with the rest of history. I mean, traditionally, the Shia were quietists. In other words, having been a minority, their view was keep your head down. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, not Khamenei, was a real break with that when he talked about the rule of the jurisprudent. And so I just have this feeling that in the case of Iran, as to some extent in a different way in the case with Russia, we just don't know what's going on below the surface. We can't know what's going on below the surface. Things may erupt that will surprise us, and whatever happens, it probably won't be linear. That's not much comfort, but it I think it gets just to the level of uncertainty that there is in the world that we're operating in now.
I completely agree with that. Actually, could end up being the hardliners, but then again, maybe not. You just don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
What about Syria? What are your
well, that's a perfect segue into Syria, right? Because no one anticipated the regime collapsing the way it did in December. Um, no one would have predicted, I think, that uh, people would be willing to invest as much hope in Farouk al-Shara, former leader of the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria, to put the country back together. Um, but but I think it's interesting that I think there are a lot of folks who are looking at it from the outside who very much want that to happen, um, but they have different ideas. I think about how to make it happen, and so I mean here again the Israelis I think are a little bit the odd ones out in the sense that they too I don't think anticipated that the regime would collapse the way it did. They are rightly very concerned about al-Shara's background, and that to have a jihadist state essentially on their doorstep would be a real problem. By the same token, I think they have tended to uh, pursue tactics um, that may make it more likely that that's what they're going to end up with in the end. And I worry a little bit. I understand why they've got a Druze population in Israel. It's got relationships with the Druze in southern Syria. Those southern Syrian Druze have become kind of clients of Israel. I worry that you're going to get the tail wagging the dog, however, and it's not clear to me that Israel taking on every grievance that the Druze have is necessarily the right approach for them to be taken to Syria writ large. So we'll have to see what happens, but that's my kind of take.
I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the Israelis on this one, although I think your larger point is correct. I mean, the Druze play a very interesting role in internal Israeli politics writ large, not so much as political actors, but this is a substantial minority which has been heroically loyal to the Israeli state. They
Serve in the
volunteer,
military.
serve in the military, and they're on the front lines, and they're quite heroic. What was going on in Syria and what has been going on in Syria is you have had these outbreaks of awful sectarian violence, at first directed against the Alawites,
And
and then
criminal activity. I mean, a lot of
and
this has
criminal
got to
activity. I mean, all these things end up
a lot
being
of this has got to do with the Captagon trade, which the
right.
Assad family was, uh, skimming money off of, and now the kind of the remnants of that those organized criminal,
Yeah, I mean,
activities are continuing.
there's actually a huge story to be written about Captagon in the Middle East, this illicit drug, because I mean, a lot of the attackers on October 7th were high on Captagon. Um, but what was going on was what started as perhaps a kind of like a criminal interaction did become sectarian violence, and including killings, but also mutilation and stuff like that. And um, I think the Israelis, to some extent, felt that they had to do it. Now, the question is, what can you reasonably expect? Just one data point. I was talking to somebody who knows that part of the world quite well, and he said, actually, one thing about Chara is he's actually at odds with a lot of his own military, to the extent that there's an organized military, which is much more the hardcore ISIS types, and who are involved in some of this. So he's kind of riding this bicycle down the middle of the path. But I think it raises a larger point, which is, you know, we we're always searching for the simplest narrative. Okay, he's somebody, so and so is an unredeemed bad guy, or so and so used to be a bad guy, but now he's come over to our side, so he's a reformed bad guy. He's actually now a good guy. When people do change and evolve to their circumstances, they may retain some of the things that were always part of them. They may go back to what they were. They may evolve in a different direction. And the problem is you have to be willing to kind of work with some of these kinds of people while always keeping one hand on the pistol on your hip in case they turn out to be as bad as they might be. You just don't know.
Yeah,
When
I
I've
agree with
spoken to
that.
Israeli military people, they say, yeah, actually, we were having kind of quiet talks with the Syrians, and it was okay. By the way, just since the Middle East is always grim, the one place where there is some rays of sunshine is Lebanon, where you do have a government that is taking advantage to the extent it can of the weakening of Hezbollah, and I think the Israelis are trying to help along with that. And if it would be possible to restore Lebanon to something like what it was in the '60s, that would be a wonderful thing. Whether it's possible or not, I don't know.
Well, the
We're,
big
we're
prize,
running.
I mean, isn't the big prize here for Lebanon and Syria to join the Abraham Accords?
Um, I don't know whether joining the Abraham Accords per se, but I think a formal peace with Israel and
Right.
normal relations with Israel, and the creation. I mean, you're stuck with the problem of the Lebanese state, so you can thank the French for that one too. What was the last census? 1936, I think.
Yeah, something
Um,
like that.
where they, sort of allocate all kinds of positions based on, the size of the religion,
Well, if you
different
did it on the census now,
religious
the
sects.
Shia would be dominant.
Well, exactly. And so the question is it possible to hammer something out? Plus, Lebanon is sort of a shattered state in many ways and bankrupt and so on. So
Yeah, the economy is
I'm not
massive.
sure I'm hugely optimistic. Yeah, I mean, one other thing about Syria is the Israelis are deeply fearful of the Turks, or at least they're deeply fearful of Erdogan. They like the Turks as people. They're very fearful of Erdogan, who they think of as Muslim Brotherhood, and
They're not wrong.
um, yeah, well, so there's, but then again, they may end up doing things which make it more likely that you'll have Turkish bases in Syria. So
Right. That's the
the
problem.
possibilities of doing counterproductive stuff. We're running out of time, and this rules. We can conclude with something that is unfortunately Middle East relevant, but I'm as a former professor and dean, I'm keenly interested, and I'm really curious to hear your point of view, and that is this settlement that the Trump administration seems to have reached with Columbia University. And I'll just stay up front that I'm deeply ambivalent about all this, but and I'm more than happy to go forth. But I'd like to hear your view. Let me actually, maybe if though I could just begin for our listeners, go through what some of the key points of this are. So uh, the un, the frozen funding gets unfrozen. Columbia pays $200 million to the U.S. government and $21 million into a Equal Employment Opportunity Commission claims settlement fund. So that's basically for people who are discriminated against. It kind of wraps up various investigations. There's an appointment of an administrator to oversee implementation of the agreement on anti-Semitism. Admissions reform. Columbia is going to bar the use of race or national origin in admissions decisions, including indirect methods like personal statements. Non-discrimination in programs and hiring. That's basically in the law. A bit more reporting than they had before on international students. Um, Although again, this is kind of within stuff that's all within the law. Um, they I think the big things are internal review of the Middle East programs. So there are several different programs. There's going to be a new senior vice provost to review its programs. Change in the disciplinary structure, which takes discipline away from the university senate, moves it to the provost. Things like banning masks in demonstrations, except for medical reasons, and bring in a sworn police force, which would have arrest, the ability to arrest.
Authority, yeah.
And then there's some stuff apparently about um, having to justify or possibly even reduce the number of foreign students, which is, I think, more dicey kind of thing. So that's
I think there's also something in there about providing the government with more transparency about the source of overseas funding for
yes.
the university.
Yes. Yeah, although that's again that is all
Yeah.
that stuff is in current law, I believe, and universities have not always been great about that.
Yeah, I too am ambivalent. I mean, I'm ambivalent, although, one of our guests earlier this year, Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, has indicated he thinks this Columbia settlement might be a pretty good template for settlements with other universities. My concern, well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to play one on our podcast, but I would be happy to stipulate, as lawyers would say, that American universities and tertiary education in the United States has, over the last, I would say, maybe 30 years, really, in the humanities, at least, really been subject to a lot of really unhealthy, I think, forces and impulses. And you can, if you want to categorize them or bin them as woke, I mean, I'm happy to say that I think that's, a reality, and that you certainly have had cancel culture, and you and I have even seen it at SAIS, which was a professional school, where I think it's even less, less prevalent than in the undergraduate, institutions. And so many of these remedies, in and of themselves, I don't really, have a bone to pick with. It sounds fairly reasonable, and certainly better in some ways than what the government was initially proposing, where they were going to go in and monitor the faculty themselves, which I think would have been truly bad. But I guess what sticks in my craw is kind of the way this has all been done, the means by which this has been accomplished, which is essentially, kind of the imposition of government power to destroy the university in order to win these concessions. Now, I know that some people will make the argument, some people you and I know will make the argument, well, it was government intervention that, created some of these problems. And that's certainly the case with the way that the Department of Education interpreted certain titles of the U.S. Code, which, among other things, in my view, led to the really over the growth of an administrative state in the university, whose very being required the continuation of the problem that they were meant to be solving. Was one of the things that led the academy to the state that it found itself in. But again, I find just the manner in which this has been done, very dangerous, and dangerous in part because eventually, there's going to be another, government elected that's going to have a different view, but have this as a precedent for imposing its agenda on the university as well. I would rather that universities had tried to heal themselves, although maybe that was impossible. I don't know.
Yeah. So I more or less agree with that. I not only found kind of the use of cracking down on anti-Semitism as a battering ram distasteful. I worry about the blowback, which I think will come. I would emphasize maybe a little bit more strongly than you did the extent to which all the precedents for this were set in previous administrations. And I don't know if you knew Charles Lipson, who was
Mhm. Yeah.
he was in graduate school roughly the same time as I was, and is now a professor emeritus at University of Chicago. And he wrote a quite interesting piece in the Daily Telegraph. I don't know why he didn't publish it in the States, saying, "Hey, the same thing, exactly the same thing happened under Obama or Biden. But the thing is that the administrative class in these universities were ideologically aligned with those administrations. So they didn't have to lean very hard, but the threat was there. And I remember that, from my own time as a professor. Um, I, I think that part of the problem is there are large parts of the universities that are broken. Sort of a minor thing, putting discipline back in the hands of the president of a university or provost, actually, I think is a very good thing, and
Hmm.
taking it away from faculty. I mean, if
Yeah.
there's one thing that my experience as a dean taught me, and I've talked to other deans, this feeling has only been reinforced, which is the idea of faculty governance is noble, and it no longer works. It's become a much more self-centered kind of business, and so you just need a different kind of structure, which is, let's face it, more like the older structure. My deepest fear in all this is that these attitudes just go underground, and the administrative state doesn't wither away. Yes, there'll be some DEI offices that get eliminated, or they begin, they'll be called something else. That actually happens at Columbia, and it's happened at Harvard too. There's no something called, I think, the Harvard Foundation, but it's the same old thing. It's just they've been folded into something much more innocuous sounding, and it reemerges. And that's in some ways the fundamental problem. I completely agree with you. It's not just the humanities. There's a lot that's wrong with the social sciences. There's a lot that's
I
deeply
mean, yeah.
there's a lot that's deeply wrong with universities when what is the percentage of grades of A minuses and A's at Yale now? It's like 80% or something like that. That
You
what
have to
that
be very courageous to give anybody a C.
you're courageous to give them a B plus.
Yeah.
I mean,
I know.
it tells me that there's something deeply wrong here. Now, will this kind of jar the universities into self awareness? I'm not so sure. Will it eliminate the problem of disciplines that aren't really disciplines and majors that are just basically ideological programs by another name? I don't know. I guess my best hope is that this spurs some kind of reflection on the part of universities, but I'm not holding my breath. And again, you know me, I'm always looking for something to be optimistic about. The thing that makes me optimistic in the United States is we have a very large array of tertiary educational institutions. And if some, get paralyzed by this sort of stuff, there'll be others that will flourish, and there will be innovation and different ways of doing business. And higher we're seeing the end, I think, of one model of higher education, which is the post World War II model of higher education. There have been other models in our history. I don't know what the new model will look like, but I just have a feeling we're headed to one.
Not to prolong this conversation, but just to tie it off, I think you and I stopped teaching at precisely the right time
Yeah.
because I really do not want to spend my waning years on this mortal coil trying to figure out if my students actually wrote their papers or whether it was written by Claude or ChatGPT or some other AI program. And from word of mouth, I think our colleagues who are still in the professoriate are wrestling almost full time with that now.
So I have a dear friend who's a wonderful historian who retired a couple of years before me, who's a man of the center left. So he's politically, he's not where I am. But we were talking about university life, and he said, my friend, he said, you and I were incredibly fortunate. We got these beautiful staterooms on the Titanic, and we managed to get into the last lifeboat.
Well, we had intended to talk about other parts of the world that are not getting the attention they deserve, and whether or not the conflicts that are breaking out there are or are not, or in some way related to the decline of the American-led order that we talked about a few weeks ago. We'll have to, put that conversation off to the future. But at least next week, I know we will be talking about a part of the world that we have neglected, and that is Central Asia. So we'll be back to do that next week. Until then, stay cool, Eliot.
Yeah, you too, Eric.